Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from around the world. We welcome you to the last day of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding 2021 virtual annual conference, focusing on the political economy of democracy, development, and peacebuilding in Africa in the COVID-19 era. My name is Mande Muyangwa, and I am the director of the Africa program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. On behalf of the Wilson Center, the Corporation of New York, thank you for joining us for what promises to be a very engaging last day of discussions. We are live tweeting today's event and taking questions online via email. To join us, please tweet your questions and tag Africa Up Close using the hashtag @PeacebuildingInAfrica or at SVNP, and you can email your comments and questions to africa@wilsoncenter.org. As in other parts of the world, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a profound impact on Africa, not only in the realm of health, but also in the areas of peace, security, democracy, and international relations. Throughout our sessions this week, we have examined various issues related to the impact of COVID on democracy and peace building in Africa, identified some of the challenges and opportunities created by the pandemic, and explored the way forward for U.S. Africa relations in the COVID and post-COVID era. Today's first session will focus on COVID-19, security and peace building, and the role of non-state actors and international stakeholders. The goal of this session is to explore and analyze the role of the non-state actors, international stakeholders as they relate to African security and peace building in the COVID era and post-COVID. Specifically, we will address the impact that COVID-19 has had on the security environment in Africa, identify the key security trends and challenges posed by non-state actors, and the impact that COVID has had on these dynamics. Then we will look at the opportunities for involving non-state actors and international stakeholders in peace building and in peace building efforts to help us overcome some of the impacts of COVID. More importantly, we have asked all of our speakers today to be forward-leaning in addressing these issues by providing options of how we might address these security challenges going forward. We have an excellent lineup of speakers to help address this topic. And my boss will open up this session by offering some opening remarks, and then unfortunately, he has to depart to attend to other obligations. The other speakers on this session will be Ms. Michelle Struck, Dr. Cyril Obi, and Mr. Nasser El Gamati. So let me first start by introducing my boss for his opening remarks. Earlier this year, the Wilson Center was delighted to welcome Ambassador Mark Green as our new President, Director, and CEO. Prior to joining the Wilson Center, Ambassador Green served as the Executive Director of the McCain Institute and as administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. Prior to USAID, he served as president of the International Republican Institute, president and CEO of the Initiative for Global Development, and senior director at the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Ambassador Green has vast Africa experience. He served as U.S. ambassador to Tanzania from the mid-2007 to early 2009. And before that, he also served in Congress representing Wisconsin. He was also the longest serving member of the board of directors of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which, as many of you know, has very strong engagement with the African continent. He has served on the Human Freedom Advisory Council for the Bush Institute and the board of the Consensus for Development Reform. I want to talk a little bit about Ambassador Green's Africa credentials and the leadership that he brings to the Wilson Center and why we are very excited to have him both for this session, but also for the Africa program's strategic engagement going forward. He led USAID, which many of you know has a very, very strong Africa portfolio, and we are looking to tapping into that experience. He has been ambassador to Tanzania. He has worked with the Millennium Challenge Corporation. He has vast experience on the Hill, which is critical to amplifying Africa's role in U.S. Foreign policy and engaging on the right issues as far as Africa is concerned in terms of strengthening U.S. Africa relations. So we are super, super excited to have him on board at the Wilson Center, and we're looking forward to working with him here at the Africa program. With that, let me turn over the virtual mic to my boss, Ambassador Green, for his opening remarks. Ambassador Green, over to you.
Thank you, Monde. You know, with those kind words, I should probably stop right now because that's about as good as it's going to get. No, thank you, and thanks to all of you for attending virtually this important annual conference. Obviously, I wish we were all gathering in person and truly hope that we'll have that opportunity soon. But nonetheless, we are grateful for this chance to host you virtually. In fact, in some ways, I guess it's appropriate that we're doing so given today's topic. The Wilson Center was chartered by Congress a little over 50 years ago to, in their words, strengthen the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. And that really is what this conference is all about, trying to learn from the challenges and opportunities that we see all around the continent. So COVID-19, well, this session obviously relates to the repercussions of the pandemic and what it means for security and fragility in Africa, what this means for African and international peace-building efforts going forward, especially the role, as you heard, of non-state actors and international stakeholders in this space. Prior to the emergence of COVID-19 just over a year and a half ago, Africa was home to 7 UN peacekeeping missions, several African Union peace support operations, and various international operations aimed at countering violent extremism around the continent. Those missions are still present today. Over the last 18 months, violent extremism in various corners has continued, and in some cases, it's worsened. Joint forces deployed by the G5 Sahel countries, supported by MINUSMA, are facing mounting security threats from non-state actors, including Al-Qaeda and Islamic State affiliates. Boko Haram continues to carry out violent attacks against civilians in the Lake Chad Basin, contributing to massive levels of human displacement. In the Horn of Africa, sadly, before our very eyes, the conflict and crisis in Tigray is worsening, and non-state groups continue to complicate the security landscape. The security situation in Mozambique is intensifying. Just a few months ago, the growing insurgency in the country's northern Cabo Delgado province inflicted a devastating attack on the town of Palma, killing dozens of civilians. At the same time, COVID-19 has damaged many African economies, with commodity exporters being hit the hardest. Africa, like much of the world, has been struck with decreased trade, increased unemployment, and major disruptions to markets and supply chains. Let's face it, the pandemic's economic pain is nearly as damaging as the disease itself. COVID-19 will probably cause decreases in African GDPs of between 1.4 and 7.8%. For some years, African economic development has been truly one of the world's great and hopeful success stories. Some now fear that COVID may push as many as 50 million Africans into extreme poverty. This economic situation is one that makes the continent all too vulnerable to violent extremism. We should be clear, while poverty does not cause terrorism, poverty, destitute poverty, can lead to despair. And despair is something that extremists know how to exploit. Sadly, they're all too adept at harnessing economic and social grievances against governments for their own diabolical and inhuman ends. In a period of COVID-driven enhanced fragility, more communities, and in particular, more young Africans will be targeted by extremists for ideological capture and recruitment. As we look at today's security and peace building landscape in Africa, it is essential to distinguish between violent extremist groups and other non-state actors such as CSOs and NGOs. These groups, along with multilateral and regional organizations, some national governments and partner nations, can all play a constructive, positive role in addressing African insecurity and fragility. From UN peacekeeping missions to France's shifting role in the Sahel to US involvement through AFRICOM and USAID, the international actors are many and the stakes are high. Of course, this complex network of actors and interests means that in order for real security and peace building progress to occur, there must be cooperation and communication on every level, local, national, regional, and global. Cooperation has always been a desired goal. The pandemic has made it an absolute necessity. African governments, with support from international friends and stakeholders, must listen to civil society organizations, must empower and enable these groups, especially at the community level. That's the way that we build resilience and foster sustainable peace. In my days with USAID, I had the opportunity to travel all around the continent and saw some truly uplifting, hopeful things. From some of the work that I saw in central Nigeria, where faith-based organizations from Christian to Muslim were sitting down and talking about community challenges and ways of keeping the lines of communication open and fostering leadership. That was uplifting. Civil society groups like women's cooperatives throughout the continent that are making decisions from small to large on how to invest savings, on how to take care of each other, and how to make sure that inputs, agricultural inputs, remain strong and flowing. Those are uplifting things. And yes, while we have challenges, we should not turn away from what has worked. We should double down and we should strengthen it. It's not enough to provide economic and humanitarian assistance, although that assistance is crucial. We need to strengthen institutions. We need to help make them more citizen-centered and citizen-responsive. Without that, fragility will continue and ensure that vulnerability continues into the future. This should be Africa's time, the time when the continent's bright young minds can not only take on Africa's challenges, but take on some of the world's challenges, make their mark on the world. We need their creative minds. We need to harness their aspirations. We need them to help us to craft new pathways to peace and prosperity, hope, and opportunity. In other words, it is in Africa's interest. It is in our interest to invest in peace building and to tackle the conditions that extremists and other violent actors all too often seek to exploit. This cannot be done unilaterally, and to try to do so, it often makes things much worse. But neither should we avert our eyes or walk away. As friends of Africa, we must be friends for Africa, joining together to help African voices foster resilience and tackle fragility. I look forward to hearing from today's panel of experts, true experts, much more experienced and adept than I am. I look forward to the lessons that they will offer as we all delve more deeply into these issues. I look forward to their insights and the policy options that they bring forward on the way forward on peace and security on the continent in this COVID era. COVID is a wake-up call and COVID is a challenge. But we also know that working together, there are so many good things that we can unleash. I'm very optimistic about Africa's future. And I think that working with CSOs, working with NGOs, and joining hands across borders, I think that's the way that we get there. Monday, thank you for this opportunity. I'm flattered to have this chance, and good luck with the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, boss. Really, really appreciate your kicking us off. You have really touched on all of the core issues, the key issues that we will need to address in this session. I appreciate the time that you took to join us this morning. And we look forward to digging deeper into some of the issues that you have discussed. So Ambassador Green has set a great tone for our discussions in this session. And so with that, let me now introduce the other speakers, Ms. Michelle Strzok, Dr. Obi, and Mr. Nasser El Gamati. We have asked each of them to offer 7 minutes of initial remarks. And after all three of them have spoken, we will get 2-minute brief contributions from Father Alain Nzadi and Mr. Gustavo de Cavallo, who will speak for just 2 minutes to add on to what our principal speakers have said. After all the speakers have spoken, we will then have a moderated question and answer period with you, the audience. And as a reminder, you can tweet your questions and tag Africa Up Close using the hashtag @Peacebuilding in Africa or @SVNP. And you can also email your questions to africa@wilsoncenter.org. With that, it is now my pleasure to introduce Ms. Michelle Strzok, who is the Principal Director for Stability and Humanitarian Affairs in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy here in the United States. In that capacity, she has policy responsibility for humanitarian assistance and disaster response, including COVID-19 global response. She also oversees DoD support to the security of U.S. embassies, peacekeeping and stability operations, amongst other things. She comes to this role with policy, national security, and practitioner experience from a career in government and the non-profit sectors. We have asked Ms. Strzok to focus her remarks on 3 questions. 1, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on the role of non-state actors in security and peace building in Africa, including 3 key trends and challenges? And secondly, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on U.S. security and peace building efforts and programs in Africa? And then thirdly, what are the 3 potential areas for U.S. Africa collaboration to address these challenges? So Ms. Strzok, over to you for your initial remarks.
Thank you so much, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone dialing in. Thank you so much for having me here today and giving me the opportunity to speak to this extremely distinguished leaders in the peacebuilding community, especially as I'm now transitioning into my new role at the Office of Stability and Humanitarian Affairs in the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy's office at the Department of Defense of the United States. My name is Michelle Strzok, and as mentioned, I lead our Office of Stability and Humanitarian Affairs, which covers a really diverse set of issues, everything from humanitarian assistance and response operations, including our global COVID-19 response, our embassy security, as mentioned, peacekeeping, and also human rights issues and humanitarian. And that includes everything, including being the lead for DoD and women, peace, and security, civilian casualty policy, and a lot of intersecting and related issues, which in the peacekeeping space, I think all really come together. Our office works closely in support of the State Department and USAID on our global response operations for humanitarian affairs. And in stabilization, we work with the Department of State and USAID across our combatant commands and our Directorate of Stabilization and Peace Operations to consolidate military gains in the aftermath of conflict and in stabilizing fragile spaces. And one big recent effort was the work done and still ongoing in Northeast Syria to defeat ISIS. We also work extremely closely with the State Department and the US mission to the UN on US government support to peacekeeping. My office oversees a variety of DoD contributions in the areas of training, logistics, doctrine, technology, and personnel, including military staff officers. And we currently have nearly 40 officers serving in UN peacekeeping operations in the Office of Military Affairs in the Department of Peace Operations at UN headquarters in New York. So I oversee a very diverse and intersecting set of issues. I was asked to make a few comments, as mentioned, on the impact of COVID-19 on the role of non-state actors in security and peace building. And first, I wanted to really situate this in the importance of Africa and the growing knowledge of that importance within our sector. Africa's strategic importance has steadily increased in the past few years. DoD understands the importance of working by, with, and through our African partners in close cooperation with our diplomatic and development communities to support and enable our African partners to contribute to regional security, which in turn drives development, good governance, and ultimately prosperity. Ending the COVID-19 pandemic is one of the top priorities of the US government today. As our Secretary of Defense of the United States stated, the greatest proximate challenge to our nation's security is the threat of COVID-19. And I know that's true not just for the United States, but for countries in Africa and countries all around the world in this unique moment where every country is facing the same problem. Given its global reach and the long tail of its consequences on every country, DoD is providing direct support to the federal government's vaccination and global response efforts in a supporting role to the State Department and USAID in this effort led by our president to build back better. In May 2021, President Biden pledged a donation of 80 million COVID-19 vaccines via COVAX, which targets some of the lowest income countries in the world, and through bilateral engagements. And as of July 18th, the US government has donated a total of 53.24 million doses and plans to donate tens of millions more in the coming weeks. While the pandemic is surging globally due to the Delta variant and other variants of concern, Africa is a region of concern. Africa faces a twin health crisis that is exacerbated by COVID-19. A high existing disease burden and fragile health systems at the same time. The continent bears nearly twice the disease burden per capita compared to the rest of the world, and COVID-19 cases are rising at an alarming rate in countries with vast disparities in healthcare system capacity. COVID-19 has strained health systems across the continent, many of whom have limited sequencing capacity and caused indirect impacts in other areas of health that all intersect, including tuberculosis detection and treatment, childhood immunization, and HIV/AIDS prevention programs. Unfortunately, it's also served as an impediment to the ongoing peace processes in conflicted areas across Africa and the world. Additionally, it has impeded the delivery of domestic services, as well as international assistance. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't emphasize the way in which COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted women and girls, delaying international progress towards gender equality. And all of these delays and roadblocks create a void that malign non-state actors can use in an attempt to exploit at-risk populations, consolidate their power, and agitate peace-building opportunities. The resulting deteriorating security situation in many countries puts undue stress and danger on local populations. That compounds the impact and threat of COVID-19 beyond the actual very serious threat of viral infection. If the underlying challenge of this pandemic cannot be controlled and overcome, I believe we will continue to see additional stress in these spaces where malign non-state actors can increase their influence, exacerbating existing tensions in local communities and undermining the efforts of local communities to end the pandemic. It's important that these nations have institutional capacity to respond to security threats. That capacity is often quite limited in many countries in Africa, and the COVID-19 response has strained the existing limited resources of many African nations. These factors are what motivates the fundamental aspect of DoD's security assistance programs, helping build the institutional capacity in ministries of defense and general staffs with allies and partners. Of course, we have to be mindful of the real ability of African partners to accept and absorb these programs, depending on the capacity in each country, be it training, equipment, or another capacity. We don't want to force any kind of one-size-fits-all solution, and we appreciate the unique nature and needs of each bilateral relationship to understand what's appropriate, feasible when we're designing these assistance programs. And while the US, as I mentioned, is donating vaccines, many of which are going to the AU via COVAX, vaccines alone are not going to end the pandemic. While we work tirelessly to vaccinate the world, we have to ensure that the resiliency of health systems, including people operating them and utilizing them, will help prevent failure and destabilization. And so the department is working with providing support to our African partners and allies, including $85 million in immediate need capacity building and vaccine readiness support. And these are an important contribution to the US government and other governments' goals of ending the pandemic. Regarding the impact of COVID-19 on US security and peacebuilding programs in Africa, one of the biggest impacts of COVID-19 has had on peacekeeping efforts at the UN has been the suspension of rotations in and out of missions by troop contributing countries. That's what we call TCCs. And these serve in UN peacekeeping missions in Africa, including Mali, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, Sudan, and Abyei. Since contingents are provided by individual countries, each country has different ways that they rotate units and different rules in terms of how long their contingents serve once deployed and protocols that are taken to prevent transmission of COVID-19 if and when individual units or soldiers get infected. While there haven't been intense flare-ups of violence in any of the UN peacekeeping missions, we have seen violence arise in Ethiopia, which is the largest provider of troops to UN peacekeeping in the world. And there is a lot of ongoing discussion regarding the fact that Ethiopia's defense forces have been part of the violence in Tigray and what that means for their peacekeeping contributions. The US currently has 30 highly qualified military staff officers serving in important roles in the Big Four peacekeeping missions across Africa in Mali, South Sudan, DRC, and CAR. And thanks to the creativity of the staff and the commander of the US Army's military observer group, USMOG, which provides administrative control over US peacekeepers once deployed, we were able to maintain our normal rotations of peacekeepers since April 2020, while still observing all of the COVID-19 protocols in place to ensure peacekeepers were not exposing missions or the local populations to threat. Many of the State Department's efforts through their Global Peace Operations Initiative have been canceled or delayed due to the restrictions on travel, but thankfully these efforts are beginning to resume. But we must remain vigilant because COVID-19 still, as we know, is posing a major and increasing threat to the African continent. In thinking about potential areas for US-Africa collaboration to address these challenges, our collaboration must consider a whole of government approach. DoD and the United States can play an important role, supporting role for these US efforts. First, we see the continuation of US support to the operational capacity of the AU's Africa Center for Disease Control as key to continuing to address the ongoing challenges of COVID-19 and the future challenges that we are sure will arise from other infectious diseases. Strengthening the Africa CDC will develop resilience across the continent in health capacity, health security, and biological threat reduction. The Africa CDC has developed and adapted trainings, hosted webinars, and developed information education materials to meet the needs of AU member states. The Africa CDC has quickly developed and distributed guiding documents to help guide their national level action plans on numerous topics. And they've had success in operationalizing its three-tiered structure, including continental, regional, and national, and leverage these to support and establish communication channels, most recently for countries to exchange that critical information needed to address COVID-19. And the idea for this Africa CDC was born out of the Ebola outbreak. And the purpose is to strengthen capacity and capability of Africa's public health institutions and partnerships to detect and respond quickly to disease outbreaks based on data-driven interventions. DoD currently plays a role in supporting military medical corps capabilities with African partners, providing partners with the ability to augment civilian medical capacity in key areas like biological threat detection and medication, emergency response and treatment. We see an opportunity for DoD to further this assistance by coordinating logistical support to COVID-19 relief with African partners who are capable of augmenting these efforts with additional airlift assets. Another area I believe DoD can have impact is supporting the US role in peace building in Africa through our support to peacekeeping activities. From the DoD perch, we look to enable our partners who work to expand and improve troop contributing countries' capacity to create more effective peacekeepers. We are currently looking to build strong and long-lasting bilateral partnerships, which will promote mission performance, accountability, strengthen protection of civilian efforts, protect civilians, prevent sexual exploitation and abuse, and increase the involvement of women in meaningful roles at all ranks in peacekeeping and peace building, which is critical to having a lasting peace. Our humanitarian assistance program intersects with women, peace, and security because we know that women and girls are affected by disasters and conflicts and crises. And in many cases, gender roles and norms mean that women are the primary caregivers for families and frontline workers in communities of crisis. So we ensure that the distinct needs of women and girls are met, including by providing equitable access to education, health, shelter, water, sanitation, and humanitarian assistance. And the last area I'll mention is just that we learned a lot from the Ebola crisis. DoD was involved in the US government response, and the lessons that we learned, we've had a big impact on countries that were able to control the outbreak in a way that it hasn't become a global pandemic. And so we are committed to learning those lessons and applying them to our work in COVID-19 as we work to support African allies and partners. And with that, I thank you so much for this opportunity to speak, and I'm happy to listen to the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Appreciated that overview of what the USG in general and DoD in particular are doing in terms of engaging Africa on the security front and on the health front, how COVID has impacted those efforts, and some of the new lines of effort, as well as continuing lines of effort as we look beyond COVID. So thank you so much for your intervention there. Let me now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Cyril Obi, who is the Program Director for the African Peacebuilding Network, otherwise known as APN, and the Next Generation Social Sciences in Africa program at the Social Sciences Research Council in New York. He brings extensive experience, networking and publishing experience on African peace, security, and development issues. The APN is a fellow Carnegie grantee and a great partner for the SVNP, and I'm absolutely delighted to have Dr. Obi here with us today. We asked Dr. Obi to focus his remarks on the following points. First, again, attending to the question of the impact of COVID-19 on the security environment in Africa, looking at the key challenges, and then also offering 2 to 3 policy options on how we might address those challenges. We've also asked him to focus on some of the success stories involving non-state actors in peace building processes and what role the international stakeholders can play in advancing these efforts. So Dr. Obi, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Monday. I hope you can hear me. Okay, good. Yes. Good morning and good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to share some of my thinking. I also want to thank the SVNP for inviting me to contribute to these discussions. So with over 6 million infections and over 150 recorded deaths and a critical shortage of vaccines, the COVID-19 pandemic is contributing towards the disruption of everyday life with far-reaching implications for politics, economics, and security in Africa. This pandemic is exacerbating structural inequalities, injustices, and inequities between countries, regions, and across societies, with vulnerable sections of the populace, particularly the poor, the unemployed, and the hundreds of thousands that have lost their livelihoods, ethnic, racial, and religious minorities, IDPs, women and young people, bearing an increasingly disproportionate burden of its negative impacts. According to the World Bank estimates, remittances to middle and low-income countries is expected to decline by between 10 to 14%. And the African Union has noted that in 2020, Africa could lose up to 500 billion in deficits or lost revenues. And revenues are being lost because of the decline in the demand for the traditional commodity exports of African countries. The oil-producing countries have been particularly hit. And so that sense of indebtedness and growing poverty complicates the picture because it impacts on state capacity, or what you may want to call state incapacity in certain spheres and in certain regions. The situation is further complicated by rising poverty levels that threatens to wipe out years of economic progress, growth, and also social progress. So with lockdowns and school closures leading to disruption in education, job losses, and unemployment, the environment for peace is being threatened because it becomes actually more fragile. According to some sources, 150 million people have reverted into poverty, while 75% of women have lost their livelihoods in Africa. This has deepened both the complexity and depth of the security challenges facing the continent. And I think speakers before me have already alluded to the fact that COVID-19 is feeding many of the drivers of conflict and instability on the continent. While responses to the pandemic have directly or indirectly contributed to the shrinking of civic and social spaces, the collapse of welfare schemes, and the erosion of social safety nets, unfortunately, the violation of human rights, and in some cases, the backsliding into authoritarian modes of governance, including the excessive use of violence in enforcing COVID-19 pandemic-related restrictions and lockdowns. Also, armed non-state actors have increasingly challenged the state, undermining its capacity to exercise its monopoly of the use of force, particularly in borderlands and rural communities. Such groups include transnational criminal networks, armed bandits, extremist insurgent groups, and these groups have intensified their activities across various countries by exploiting the conditions exacerbated by the pandemic to spread terror and increase their influence. So it's not so much that COVID is causing these things. It is that COVID is exacerbating the conditions under which violent non-state actors are beginning to actually cause a lot of instability. On the other side, the challenges posed by COVID, either in terms of lost livelihoods, in terms of security challenges, is also opening up space and opportunities for building local resilience in certain communities. And some local grassroots organizations, particularly when you look at areas like Northeast Nigeria, some local groups have successfully been able to navigate this terrain of insecurity to create not just resilience, but new forms of livelihoods and new forms of collaboration that are usually always below the radar. Let's take a little step back and then look at what I call shrinking budgets and shifting priorities. That in terms of multilateral organizations and in terms of the global community, we see a situation in which the pandemic has impacted both developed and developing countries. And this has had implications for the ways in which resources are allocated. There is the need for developed countries to prioritize their own populations, which are also being impacted by the pandemic. And this means that there is less to go into things like international aid, international intervention. Secondly, there is also the fact that in terms of priorities, a lot of the international money is also going into meeting what you consider to be the security spin-offs of the pandemic as a form of threat. And therefore, what you have is that a lot of money is going into humanitarian intervention, health intervention, and less is available for security and peace building. So the question is, what are the likely solutions? I think the first thing is to sound a note of warning or a cautionary note that we should avoid quick fixes and focus on addressing the structural drivers of violence and insecurity through a well thought out alternate agenda of conflict prevention. And this should take place within a comprehensive policy framework for coordinating energies, resources, and initiatives of peace-building actors at the local, state, and international levels. The other issue that probably will need multilateral actors to take action is the whole issue of vaccine equity. While we understand that there are structural drivers of conflict that have been exacerbated by the impact of the pandemic, we also recognize the fact that for Africa to embark on the road to recovery, there has to be vaccine equity. So far, Africa has received less than 2% of vaccines distributed globally and has one of the lowest vaccination rates in the world. COVAX has told us that only 19 out of 66 vaccine doses have been delivered as at May 2021. The problem is also compounded by poor management of vaccines and shortage of distribution, and something that is also happening, which is the misinformation that vaccines are harmful to health. When you go on social media, you see a lot of people with this funny videos of people having magnetic arms because of the vaccination. And this information is also preventing people, even when vaccines are available, from taking those vaccines, further compounding the situation. Thirdly, we need to also look at African states themselves. Some of the earlier speakers have spoken about strengthening public institutions, but I think that it's also important that we revisit the social contracts in African states and make this more inclusive and more democratic in a manner that addresses the deep-rooted grievances, inequalities, and injustices that drive the kind of insurrections and mass disaffection that you see, particularly involving rural communities, also involving young people who are beginning to see a rather bleak future. Finally, I think we need to do more to prioritize locally inspired and led initiatives, which are usually not visible. We need to find this and try to see how we can scale them up and also give them the kind of support. And lastly, resources. That at the end of the day, all the good intentions that we may have to address and look at what the international community can do is to also get African states, the African Union, to do two things. The first thing is to revisit the African peace and security architecture in a way that responds to the emerging challenges that the COVID pandemic is beginning to unearth. And AFSA is due for a rejig, is due for renewal. And the ideas, some of the ideas that will help AFSA will be from looking at local examples of best practices where people organize their own security, when people organize their own economies, and where people try to bring together collective interests and aspirations to survive despite the challenges they face on a daily basis. And lastly, resources are very important. How can the international community raise resources in an era of shifting domestic priorities, a world that is still on the road to economic recovery, and the real everyday challenges of multilateral peacekeeping interventions in a virtual space? It's true that normalcy is returning to some of these peacekeeping operations in Africa, but the fact that staff and personnel are not able to move about freely, and some of the peacekeepers also need to observe lockdowns, is also opening the space for some of these violent actors to take advantage. And one of the strong things they are doing is the fact that because states are not distributing resources to people, they are creating alternative livelihoods on the ground, basically doing things that are not legal, but trying to replace some of the welfare states rules of states. And at this point, I will just say thank you, and I'll stop here, and we continue the discussions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Obi, for that very, very rich presentation, walking us through the impacts of COVID across the security, governance, and development sphere, looking at the areas where fragility is bound to increase, looking at how COVID-19 is feeding many of the drivers of conflict, looking at how states' response to COVID is further complicating the situation on the security front, including through the excessive use of violence by security actors in the name of COVID, and looking at how armed non-state actors taking advantage of the state's inability to deliver during this time of COVID, to further their own interests. I liked your presentation in terms of some of the things that are happening at the local level and how we might be able to tap into that, and then giving us areas, and which we'll get into further on in the discussion, about potential areas of focus to minimize fragility and get Africa back on the road to recovery. So we'll talk about all of those, but I really thank you for that really good take on key issues unleashed by COVID and how we move forward. Let me now introduce our next speaker, Mr. Anas. Sorry, I lost my, just give me a second while I find my bearings. All right, let me now introduce our next speaker, Mr. Nasser El Gamati. He is the founder and current director general of the Tripoli-based Sadiq Institute, the first public policy think tank in Libya's history, which was established back in August 2011. The Sadiq Institute is a member of the SVNP, and its work is focused on conducting qualitative and quantitative field research across east, west, and south of Libya to really help bring about security in that country. We're especially delighted to have Anas here. He represents the Northern Africa part of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding. So SVNP is not just Sub-Saharan Africa. We recognize the security implications of where North meets Sub-Saharan Africa. We recognize that the AU looks at Africa as a geographic entity rather than breaking it up at the Sub-Saharan and North Africa region. We recognize that security challenges do not stop at the Sahel, but they come down and they impact what's going on in other parts of Africa, and therefore the importance of having a North African presence within the SVNP. And so, Anas, we're looking forward to your remarks. Like the other speakers, we asked you to focus on COVID-19's impact on Africa's conflict and security and peace building landscape, and to offer your take on how international actors and non-state actors interfacing with security and peace building efforts, and then offer us some recommendations. And we really hope that you're going to bring some of that North Africa perspective to this discussion. So Anas, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Monde, for the very kind introduction to my other to the other speakers for their wonderful presentations. And then just a word about the program itself. You know, I do feel that privilege of being able to not only present about North Africa, but also to learn from the experiences of our counterparts, our colleagues from the rest of the continent. So this is a really important, it's a really important network for me. It's not a network that I feel I give too much to be honest. I feel like I take much more from it. So again, thank you very much for the kind invitation today. I'll jump straight in, because I think the context that I want to paint in Libya is a context already in conflict, and a context already dealing with a very nasty end of the pandemic, one that now many are arguing is the fourth wave. And I think it's so important to understand where Libya is. And as Monde has already mentioned, you know, North Africa's links into the Sub-Saharan Africa. Libya really is almost, despite it being quite further north, it's the communities in Libya and their bridges and their links into the rest of Africa that really tie us there, despite the geographic distance from we have from other places. When we think about the communities of Libyans that live in the south, particularly transnational groups like the Tuareg and the Tebel, who reach as far as Burkina Faso, as Niger, further south, it's these kind of measures that are more important than where our, you know, where our rain comes from or where we get our coffee from. So I'll jump straight in, and I think that's the really important aspect. And what I paint here is we are dealing with a very nasty conflict, a conflict that won't go away. And I think the timing is so crucial when to think about this. So conflict, you know, the COVID as a priority has led to so many different things. It's a phenomena, and I think we should think about it this way. Number one, it has become a priority as of the last 12 months. And at a time, almost 18 months ago, it was not a priority. And I can give very specific dates here that time and chime in together in a transformative way. January 2020 when we were hearing murmurs of a virus emanating from Wuhan, when the WHO was telling people about this virus spreading across the world, heads of state, global heads of state met in Berlin to solve the Libya conflict that had been raging since April 4th, 2019, when a renegade military general in Libya, Khalifa Haftar, launched an offensive against the UN-backed government of national accord and tried to overturn them. Now, we had at the highest level political will to solve a conflict in January 20th, 2020. Within a matter of weeks, that began to disappear. There was absolutely no, Libya has a very short window, and anyone that knows anything about the way that political will works in these conflicts, it's not often that you can get the head of, the heads of states from across the world to come and meet somewhere and definitively spend their time talking about solutions. We had that once in 2020. We had it one more time, potentially in 2011. And we had other opportunities to do this, and we'd never had that window apart from that moment in January 2020. Within a couple of weeks, when the epicenter had moved from Wuhan to South Korea, and then later started moving towards Italy, that political will had disappeared. COVID became the priority, Libya sunk down, and the conflict intensified, palpably so. It not only went from the capital in Tripoli, it moved towards the center of the country. There were more mercenaries being delivered in Libya. There were more weapons being delivered in Libya, more arms embargo violations. It essentially led to the intensification of the conflict. There were new aspects of the conflict that we hadn't seen before. There were war crimes being committed, specifically delivered in the context of COVID. The water supply to 2 million people was cut during the beginning of the pandemic, when people were being forced into their homes. These are things that that can take place at certain times, but the coincidental nature of it tells me that this was accentuated as a result of COVID. Now, that's COVID being lost as a priority and perhaps consuming the bandwidth of the international community. I think there is something else, and it's I'm preaching to the choir here. Everyone knows about the way in which non-state actors, ourselves included, as Southern Institute, how we do peace building is we do it in person. There is no alternative to doing this in person. I mean, we can speak on Skype and Zoom, and we can share our experiences across one another. And it's important that we don't lose sight of that. It has given us a benefit that we couldn't have done only 10 years ago. We couldn't have done this. But in the context of peace building, and I mean this in a very sincere way, on the side of the meeting, and I know this because the friends that I've made in SVNP, and the way that I've made those friends was not during these plenary sessions. It was afterwards when I would go out for a coffee and bump elbows with someone and talk to them. Peace building is no different. If you want to have a real conversation about something, it happens on the margins, and it has to happen in person. I know from my other colleagues that work on this in this field in Libya that they're struggling because they can't do this over Zoom in Libya. And not only can we not do it over Zoom in Libya, electricity cuts mean that we can't do this over Zoom in Libya. We have up to 16 to 18 hours of electricity cuts in Libya at times. And this is also becoming the pressure valve, which COVID is just the tip of. And Dr. Cyril mentioned this in his presentation earlier, that essentially the state is no longer able to deliver certain services. Other groups, more malevolent groups, step in. And I think that's something that we shouldn't lose sight of. As much as COVID consumes bandwidth, it's also a cover for other groups to not do their work, for the state to potentially not do their work. And we should remember that the media and international community are a pressure valve. If they're focusing on the pandemic and not on the run-of-the-mill, bread-and-butter aspects of a conflict, of corruption in the continent, of the inability to deliver socioeconomic services, those things also build up. And governments are not responsive to their citizens, but they are at times responsive to the international community. If they're not talking about these things in their meetings, these things get left and brushed under the carpet. And as we saw in August of last year in Libya, at the peak of the pandemic, there were, for the first time in almost a decade, national protests in a divided country along the very same things. And I think this is where we have to remember that the pandemic accentuates structural problems, as our other speaker mentioned, that governments now don't have the bandwidth to deal with because they like to deal with one thing at a time. So their unemployment, it's the conflict, it's the pandemic. They can't multitask. That's a big, big issue for us. I think there are some other aspects that I want to really kind of delve into, because these are aspects that I think we're losing sight of. That I don't think we've seen the worst of what the pandemic has done. But when I said cover, it's also a cover for international actors in particular to break arms embargoes, to deliver weapons when they know that either the international community, when I say international community, I don't mean the UN emblem. I mean the men and women who work at these desks in places like Tunis or in places like Geneva, and then have to leave and go home. And then they have to, find a nanny for their children. That takes up kilobytes and bandwidth. You don't have time to deal with those issues. And under that cover, there are arms embargo violations that have taken place in Libya, particularly by liberal actors like Russia, the United Arab Emirates, who have then had major knock-on effects. And we can see these effects very, very recently. Mercenary groups that had made their way into Libya to use it as safe haven. The ambassador who mentioned these kind of groups at the beginning of his comments, transnational groups and terrorist groups, the FACT rebels that killed Idris Deby several months ago, were trained and equipped by Russian mercenaries in Libya, who were financed by the United Arab Emirates over the last 2 years. And then look at the domino effect. They killed the head of a state and no one saw it coming, all under the cover of the conflict, and under the cover of the pandemic. I think it's these aspects that when we talk about how non-state actors do their role, I mean, we have a multiple layered role right now. Our role is to expose and to shine a light on the ways in which the media can no longer do this because journalists are no longer coming to Libya. They're no longer able to cover the stories and give them priority. The second aspect is that we feel a palpable sense of the very actors that we want to meet with and I speak to continuously are being ripened towards conflict as a result of these things. They're being ripened towards conflict and not compromise. That could also break the ceasefire. Now, the final aspect that I'll go into is that there is a ceasefire that remains in Libya, a very physical line of a ceasefire, that because of the pandemic, we only measure this line. It divides Libya from east to west. And as long as no one crosses that line between east and west, the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, then the international community believes that everything is going fine. If they listen to non-state actors that are working on the ground, if they took advantage of the fact that conflicts are complex mechanisms and that cannot be measured by one single line, we see a number of things that we can solve and that we can do. The first is that disinformation networks are really important, more so now in the day and age that we live in, and because of the pandemic, with more people turning to online sources to learn about the news, to learn about what's happening outside, to speak to their friends. Disinformation mechanisms and campaigns are on the up. I would certainly say that in Libya. The one thing that we can do to kind of tackle this is to work with social media organizations in ways in which to try and stop that, because they provide the fuel, which essentially they provide the platform and the fuel for conflicts, especially for intercommunal local conflicts, where you can't just speak to a head of state and ask them to stop it. This is not in their control. That's the way that conflicts are taking place in Libya. The second aspect is, ripening. I think in the absence of what we're able to do on the ground and being able to have these meetings, when we do have these meetings, I'm planning on going back to Tripoli probably in the next 6 weeks. I'm worried about what I'm going to see and who I'm going to meet with and what they're going to tell me when I get there, because the first measure for me is what I said earlier on, is ripening. If I feel that people are more ripened towards conflict, despite the fatigue of almost a decade of conflict, despite the fatigue of the pandemic, then what does that tell you about how they're being ripened? Essentially, for the most part, they're being ripened because arms embargoes are being violated by international actors. That's something that we can't stop on the ground. It's not something that a non-state actor can stop. This is something that the international community has to prioritize, and it means having very difficult conversations with other states. And so that's where I want to kind of leave this off. But I would just say, to put in a nutshell, this pandemic is beyond just measuring it by those that are in hospital beds, how many vaccines we have. I think study the phenomena of what it's been able to allow states and non-state actors to do. And we're going to understand a lot more about what our work will transform into over the next several years. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Monday.
Thank you so much, Anas. And I really appreciate how you were able to bring into a country case study the points that have been raised by the three previous speakers. Just a really, really powerful presentation on Libya, the conflict that won't go away, on how COVID has disrupted a potential opportunity for peace, at least bringing the conflict to a standstill, and then looking forward to how you build a peace in Libya, walking us through the fact that, and this I thought was a really, really important point about how you cannot do peace building via Zoom. It has to be done in person. Those personal relationships that you build, the trust that you're able to build, that you really cannot do over platforms such as Zoom. You talked to us about how the media because we're unable to travel, how the media, the spotlight on the situation in Libya has sort of gone away, because now everybody is focused on COVID and these other issues that speak directly to matters of conflict, to issues of peace building, are no longer in the spotlight, and that has come at a cost. And really just a lot here that I hope we are going to be able to get into during our Q&A. So thank you very much again for really bringing the key issues down and tying them directly to a case study, a country case study, a situation in one country where people are being impacted daily, and it's a matter of life or death for so many Libyans. And so thank you for that. Let me now turn to our next speaker, and I'm hoping he will also just comment in 2 minutes to highlight how these issues speak to the situation in the DRC. So Father Elaine Anzadi will provide brief remarks, and he is the Managing Director on the Center for Action for Social Research, otherwise known as CEPAS in Kinshasa in the DRC. And I'm happy to say that CEPAS is also a member of the Southern Voices Network for Peace Building. So Father Anzadi, your 2-minute reaction to what our speakers have said, or if you want to tie this issue to the DRC, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Monde, for the floor. First of all, it's good to know that peace has always been a big challenge in DRC for the last 25 years or so. No need to remind us that the country holds the largest UN mission, MONUSCO, in the world, with more than 20,000 UN personnel. The government has established a state of siege in the eastern part of the country, mainly in Ituri and the North Kivu regions, since 6 May of this year, in order to better address the peace challenges in that part of the country. As of today, the state of siege has been in place for the past 2.5 months, but the outcome results are still wanting. So therefore, for a lasting peace, I identify 2 main challenges and avenues of intervention in DRC. One, instability in the eastern part of DRC, and an avenue of intervention there involve local communities in the shaping of a different landscape as far as peace building is concerned. And civil society organizations have a big role to play here, and therefore they need to be empowered and offered resources to achieve this mission and meet the challenges that stand in their way. 2, political instability, which is for me the outcome of non-transparent and non-inclusive 2018 electoral process. And here again, an avenue of intervention is to empower civil society organizations in order to be not only the government watchdog, but also the guardian of our democracy. Because my belief and conviction is that democracy, to put it with Greg Mills and other authors, is a better chance for Africa to achieve a long-lasting peace. A more positive future for African countries depends on their ability to make democracy work. Strengthening Africa's democracies in general and DRC in particular will improve the continent's development prospects, because the alternative of authoritarian and autocratic rule will not achieve long-term development and peace. Experience shows that after these so-called strong leaders, it is usually the flood. So those are, for me, the 2 main challenges and possible avenues where I think the civil society and international actors can play an instrumental role in DRC. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Elaine. And it's interesting because, again, another case study of the DRC. We've had a peacekeeping mission there, as I said, for over 20 years, and yet peace remains elusive. And what I'm hearing from you, which is a theme I've heard throughout this conference, about really we've tried and we've put a lot of emphasis on top-down approaches to peace building, that it's now time for us to think about how we invest more in bottom-up approaches to peace building. So how do we empower the owners of the peace, the people who have to leave the peace or insecurity on a day-to-day basis, to make sure that they are the guardians of the peace, as you said. So thank you so much for that. Let me round up our speakers for this session by turning over the virtual mic to our colleague, Mr. Gustavo de Carvalho, who will also provide brief 2-minute remarks. He is a senior researcher and in the Peace Operations and Peace Building Division at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa. And the ISS, again, is another member of the SVNP. Gustavo, your 2-minute remarks, please.
Thank you so much, Monde, and thank you for the first 5 panelists, which makes it incredibly hard to add something new, and so many very rich discussions were presented. But I wanted to reflect a little bit on the issue around COVID-19 and how to deal with non-state actors, because I think what most of the speakers mentioned is that the structural challenges around engaging with non-state actors and to develop more effective peace-building responses are not due to COVID-19. It is an issue, and the challenges that we face right now are not so different than the challenges we faced 2 years ago. And I wanted to highlight this within a context of what I call a global commitment gap. We tend to talk about peacekeeping operations as a panacea for responses, where increasingly peacekeeping operations are deployed to respond to any type of peace and security actions. And we need to reflect on that, not just from a conceptual point of view, but to ensure that member states, and in that case, particularly permanent members of the UN Security Council, empower not only the role of the Security Council, but also the role of the Peacebuilding Commission. This global commitment gap is very visible in peacekeeping operations when you see that developed countries tend to pay for peacekeeping operations and developing countries tend to send troops. And when we see that the fact that the peacekeeping budget of the UN increasingly under pressure by member states to be reduced, compose less than 1% of the annual expenditure in defense issues in a country like the United States. So what I wanted to say here is that I think there is the need to strengthen the capacity of institutions that have shown better ability of dealing with non-state actors, that it's obvious in the case of the African Union and regional economic communities, and developing not only funding, but predictable and sustainable funding. Second, that we identify more champions amongst developed countries, that we don't have them slipping out of almost the top 100 top troop contributing countries, like it's the case of the United States. It's for me unacceptable that the 3rd largest army in the world barely deploys troops to peacekeeping operations. But that can only be done when there is an understanding that several institutions will work together to be able to move beyond just this always very stand-centric process and provide more effective responses to conflicts. Thank you so much. You were mute, Monde.
I'm slow to unmute myself this morning. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you digging deeper into those issues. Absolutely critical, and I'm hoping that our speakers will be able to delve deeper into them. Let me now open the floor up for discussion. And let me just go to document here that contains the questions. If you just give me a second, I'll be with you. All right, so we have a question that comes from Professor Anne Moisen, who is the chair of the Strategic Studies at National Defense University in Washington, D.C. And her question is, the Biden administration has stressed the importance, the requirement to tie U.S. foreign policy directly to the middle class. That said, how do you truly convince the typical American Western country that refocusing limited resources from the U.S. To rebuilding post-COVID, sorry, let me rephrase. That said, how do you truly convince the typically American Western country that refocusing limited resources from the U.S. Western rebuilding post-COVID to African issues, needs, thousands of miles away and remote from their daily lives and priorities? So I think Anne's question really goes back to this issue that Western countries, including the US, are themselves in the midst of rebuilding post-COVID, or looking ahead to rebuilding their economies and countries in the COVID era. So how are you going to convince the American people that shifting some of these resources to engage with Africa is a worthwhile endeavor? So that's one question, and we'll pose that one first to Michelle. The second question goes to Anas, which is based on your presentation, is peace building even doable during COVID? Or do antagonists press on and leverage COVID, but governments and international community activities stop as they are unable to multitask, as you said? What is the answer specifically on Libya, as COVID doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon? Let me go to another question. Sorry, this one is also directed to Michelle. I have another set of questions coming, but the others should also feel free to comment. This is a question from Ni Akwete to Michelle, and the question is, you correctly stressed resilience. So do you see the vaccine trips waiver contributing to resilience, or what do you think of German and UK opposition to trips which President Biden has embraced? So let me take this first round of questions, and then I'll take another round. But we'll open it up. We'll start with you, Michelle, go to Anas, and then allow Dr. Obi to comment if he has comments on any of the questions that have been posed so far. So Michelle, over to you.
Thank you so much. Really fantastic questions. And I just want to say thank you so much to the panelists as well for the incredible themes that they have outlined today. For this question on the middle class, I think of what I would tell my own family, coming from New Jersey, where I'm from, a family that doesn't have a lot of experience in international relations. And the answer I go to is that we are all interconnected. If the pandemic, if climate change, if the other kind of digital threats that we're facing that are impacting people's lives in the US, if these aren't proof that we're all interconnected and that the world's problems require collective action, which is what President Biden said in his interim national security guidance, then what will? And so I think that, pointing to this important big bet that the United States is making, that our values-driven approach to promoting democracy around the world and to uplifting our partners with humility is going to lead to changes that people in the world will see the United States as a valued partner that is there, not just as part of collective action, but as enabling that collective action to really coalesce with strong, values-based commitments with follow through. I think that's what the United States demonstrates in this guidance. And so for the middle class, they can see in their lives that when things are shutting down around them, and when threats are happening to them on the internet, that's not happening in the void, it's happening in an interconnected world. And Africa has an extremely important role to play, whether they're thinking about it or not, connected to many of their daily lives. So collective action, to me, and the US role in that is really the answer. And it is such a small part of the US budget, but it's a small part of the US budget with an incredibly important outsized role. And that's both peacekeeping in terms of the defense budget, and that's also, as another speaker mentioned, and that's also our, related foreign assistance that the United States is sending, and our interconnected network of multilateral support that we are providing. All of these things, I think, are contributing to this kind of collective action that is required to meet the demands that are demonstrated not just by COVID, but by the other threats that the average American is facing today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anas, I will come to you, but let me do this before I come to you, because the question that Michelle just answered also, I think, speaks directly to a comment that Dr. Obi made in terms of shrinking budgets and shifting priorities, and how developing countries are focusing on their own populations that are impacted by COVID. So Dr. Obi, let me see if I can put on this question and see what your response would be to the questions about how you convince Americans and ordinary Americans and other Europeans that it's worth shifting some of these resources to help Africa address some of the COVID related issues that you outlined in your presentation. How can you make a convincing argument that that is a worthwhile investment?
Thank you very much. I will not pretend that that is an easy or a simple question. I think the first thing is trust. I think the trust between the government and the people on this side has to be such that citizens will trust that their government will always act in their best interests. So that is somewhere to start from. The second thing is that it's actually true that while COVID is not the cause of the conflict and instability and fragility, it is accentuating and deepening them. But the worst impact really is the way it is undermining and weakening the social fabric. Now, when you understand that the middle class occupies a strategic position in the social fabric in Africa, and when Michelle's well-considered point about how connected we are, it will be clear that it's in the national interest to restore the social fabric and strengthen the social fabric in Africa, of which the middle class plays a role. Don't forget that a lot of the issues about the failings of the state in certain areas has to do with the fact that economic crisis has wiped away the middle class. And the most critical human infrastructure and human resources are migrating out of the continent. If they are able to be retained on the continent, and if they are able to actively participate in politics, which some of them view as a dirty game, ultimately and cumulatively over the long run, it will impact positively on this country. So I think that is a very important point. I'll stop there. I got the signal.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Obi. Let me turn it over to Anas to respond to the Libya questions.
Thanks, Dr. Monde. I think my answer actually is to both questions, essentially, because I think there's a way to understand, based on especially on Michelle's comments, a friend of mine said right at the beginning of the pandemic, he said it was like those movies in the 60s, right? The aliens are finally invading. This is something that should be the most, globally binding moment in history. And it showed, unfortunately, that it wasn't. And I think to some degree, that is the main challenge, right? Getting people to work multilaterally, getting people to understand the global nature of challenges. I, of course, have a bias when I speak about Libya as a Libyan. So, of course, I see it as the center of my universe. But what I would say here is that, there is something that could be said about trying to, or maybe my answer is objective in a sense, which is that the challenges that we face in Libya are of a global nature. And I would say that is why we can't say that peace building has to stop. or that potentially that we can't do it at this time. Now, there is a role that the international community can play in that peace building process, which is to inoculate Libya's conflict, thinking of its borders, its land and sea borders, from any malevolent actors, from delivering arms, weapons, mercenaries, materials that can be used for war. Without that chain, or without that trickle down of weapons and material to support conflict, you can't have a conflict. And I know this, from cycles of looking at conflicts in Libya, where when the weapons dry up, they begin to look for compromise. And I think that's really, really important. I would say that it is about setting a number of conditions before perhaps the kind of peace building that I spoke about can take place. And the first is, there is already fatigue in Libya. When people are fatigued from conflict, they no longer want to continue. And I think that's something that is monitored very closely by malevolent actors that monitor social media sentiment and work out whether or not Libyans have the appetite. But it's certainly accentuated now by the pandemic. The second is that we have a mutually hurting stalemate. That's why the stalemate in Libya and the ceasefire goes right down the middle. But this mutually hurting threat, I think, in Libya is really where people understand on both sides of the divide, this pandemic doesn't discriminate. We know that it's going to affect you whether you support this side or that side. And that's why they need to give peace a chance. This is really where the conditions are perfect now, in a sense, for the international community to inoculate Libya. And that's what the word I would use. Inoculate Libya's conflict from malevolent actors, illiberal actors, and illiberal factions from trying to ripen Libya towards conflict, or looking for a solution that suits themselves. But there's no skirting the responsibility of the international community. I mean, Gustavo mentioned this briefly in his comments as well, and I wholeheartedly agree. Countries like the US and global powers have more of a responsibility. If you are a dual member of the European Union and the UN Security Council, like France, for example, you have a higher obligation to prioritize Libya, because this is your role. And I think that's where we have to start to understand what that political will could look like. And I think it goes back to Dr. Cyril and Michelle's point about understanding the interconnectedness. Number one, I would say for Libya, Russian presence in Libya is directly in NATO's southern flank. If you want to speak to an American audience member, that's not something that they'll understand, but AFRICOM understand that. And it is driving a wedge between members of NATO's coalition and the southern flank, between Italy and France, between France and Turkey. These members are turning in on themselves. International norms in conflict are being broken during the pandemic. And prior to the pandemic, there were new ways of funding wars that we never imagined were possible. No one imagined that you could just print a counterfeit version of a sovereign country's currency and deliver it. Russia delivered $10 billion worth of Libyan dinars and forced them onto the Libyan government over the last several years. These are things that we can't skirt away from these problems. Mercenaries, not militaries, are now fighting in Libya for deniability. That's another thing that COVID offers as a cover. If your militaries aren't there and pandemic is being a cover for you, then we realize these conflicts are going to get worse. And which are the countries that are being affected? All of the countries that Monde mentioned at the beginning, the Sahel, right? I mean, going further into sub-Saharan Africa, these are people that leave Libya and go and fight in Mali, or go and fight in Niger, or go and fight in Chad. So I think it is about prioritizing the role, the unique role, and the sole role that the international community has in upholding those things. And it also means moving into a second dimension of sanctions, economic sanctions towards actors and illiberal factions. Russia, the United Arab Emirates, China is a great example of this. You need to start doing these things. Otherwise, number one, these conflicts get worse. Number two, the norms of conflicts are broken. And number three, and most importantly, at the geostrategic level, coalitions like NATO, which are of huge geostrategic importance for the West, these coalitions are becoming fragile. There are new fissures there that weren't there 18 months ago. And those fissures are entry points for fractures and the breaking down of the global norms that we have known over the last 6 to 7 years. So they would be my arguments if I was to give them. And I'm sorry for answering two questions, but I felt, two birds with one stone. What can I do?
That's why you're here, and thank you so much. We are coming, I think, to the end of this session. Let me do this. A lot of our SVNP members mostly work in that NGO space, that civil society space. And one of the points that has come out throughout this week and also came out in this session is the need to empower civil society organizations to engage them more in the peace building process, to allow them to own it. It is their piece. So let me conclude with a number of questions related to that. But I'll also give you 2 other questions. I need for our speakers to pick one question, respond to it in a minute, and then we will close since we're coming to the end. So my first question is, we have talked about empowering, the imperative of empowering civil society organizations. If peace is to take hold on the African continent, if fragility is to be effectively addressed. So what can the international community do concretely to help empower civil society organizations? What needs to change in terms of how the international community is engaging with civil society organizations, or what are the opportunities for more effective engagement with civil society organizations to help move us forward to this sustainable peace that we are seeking? The second question really has to do with a point Dr. Obi raised, that the African peace and security architecture is lagging behind the security threats that actually confront the continent. So concretely, Dr. Obi, for you, what would be some of the things that need to happen in terms of rejigging the Africa peace and security architecture to catch up with the actual threats that are confronting the continent? And then we raised the issue of financing. It's come up, stressed Western budgets, African countries not directing more of their resources into this peace building space, addressing fragilities space. So I wonder if any of you is in a position to comment on the potential role of the private sector, both in Africa and globally, to contribute more to this peace building space, to this addressing fragility space. So please pick one, just a minute, address whichever question you want to address, and then we'll bring this very rich session to a close. So I don't know who wants to go first. Anas, you look like you're ready. You want to go first?
Sure, okay. So in a minute, in terms of financing from the private sector, I think, there is no perfect answer. You're going to be dealing with organizations and companies that you may have a moral reluctance to work with, like oil companies in the energy sector. But I think because they rely upon the conditions that peace needs to bring around, security and stability to be able to extract those resources, they are agile vehicles and mechanisms to be able to, offer some funding to these organizations. But there is no getting away from your first point about the financing and the structural issues that are lagging, especially on the continent. I would say that there needs to be an endowment for peace and security for organizations to be able to agilely respond to and not have to wait 18 months to get funds in for conflicts that start, start and stop again. And I think there needs to be an agile funding mechanism, an endowment of sorts on the continent. It could be done through, other NGOs, or it could be done through multilateral bodies, but there needs to be an agile financing mechanism. That's my minute.
I think in that comment, thank you so much, Anas. I think when we often talk about non-state actors, we forget about the private sector, which is why I brought it up. But I think in your comment, embedded in your comment, maybe not directly, is that the African Union does have a peace fund, but perhaps we need to make that, apart from growing it, make it a little bit flexible and agile beyond where it is today. Michelle, your 1 minute, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Obi.
Thank you so much for these great questions. I'll answer the one on civil society. The federal government of the U.S. will never have a monopoly on expertise. And the first to say that we need a variety of voices to be engaged in policy deliberations from, in the U.S., our state, municipal, tribal, civil society, outside the U.S., of course, nonprofit, private sector actors, as people mentioned, faith-based actors. We need these perspectives. And so I would just want to acknowledge how important that question is. It's the, for our work on peace building, I think one model that we could point to is that we're currently beginning the implementation of the Global Fragility Act, which has a new model in it, if folks haven't seen it, of ensuring that there is an emphasis on encouraging, empowering local and national actors to address the concerns of those citizens, including people in vulnerable communities, to build resilience. Getting to that other question on resilience, these are extremely important, I think, to think about. There's a way of doing work in the federal government in the US that we're in our foreign policy right now, we're working to refresh. We're working to look at new solutions to the challenges that we're meeting today, not the challenges of 10 or 20 years ago. And so I think this model is really instructive, and it's something we'll be implementing that you can look to for a way forward. And thank you so much again for the chance to speak today.
Thank you, Michelle, and I appreciate you raising the Global Fragility Act. We did actually have a session on it earlier this week, so thank you so much. And we're looking forward to that when it's completed and ready to be rolled out. We appreciate your remarks. Dr. Obi, bring us home.
Thank you. I'll just make 3 quick points. The first is that this is a time for innovative and responsive, inclusive uptake by the African Union, particularly focusing on locally led initiatives on peace building. And this should be imputed into redrafting and redesigning security architectures. Secondly, is the gap between early warning and action, that the early warning systems have to be rejigged in such a way that action in terms of political will to act and back such actions by a broad consensus is key. And thirdly, the architecture needs to be responsive to challenges that are emerging around borderlands and transnational mobilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic panel. I think we really got off to a fantastic start with Ambassador Mark Green, and then our 3 principal speakers did a fantastic job of really digging into both international engagement on the post-COVID environment, the case studies, and more broadly, what Dr. Obi talked about. And then Fadanzadi on the DRC, and Gustavo talking about that international dimension and some of the funding issues and the peacekeeping issues that we need to look at. So please, please, please join me to thank all of our speakers for a really, really great and rich session. Really appreciate you. I think we covered a lot of ground, and I'm hoping that some of our SVNP members are going to take some of these issues and dig deep into them and figure out how we can make them come alive on the African continent and offer more solutions to those who actually make policy on these issues, point them in the right direction in terms of the issues that really impact Africa. So thank you so much again, and thank you to you, the audience, for joining in and for sending in your questions. We're now going to take a short, or a 27-minute break before we start the next session at 10:30 Eastern Standard Time on our end. And that session is going to focus on beyond silencing the guns, reflections on challenges and recommendations for the way forward. I invite all of you to join us for that session. So goodbye and see you at the next session.